Real quick, I recorded this entire video on the creator experience server, meaning that the gameplay footage that you see may not be indicative of the final product, but all of the information that I provide in the video is. It's a guide video. I want to get everything correct. While most of us just went broke for Acheron, the power of Gamba is undeniable. Everywhere I turn, I see Jade tiles, 0 cycle clears, and 50/50s. Given the choice to one-shot everything in the game or have a small, tiny, itty-bitty chance to win, I'm always taking the chance because it's more fun and winners win. I can stop anytime I want. Similarly to how our favorite gremlin encourages you to win every single time, Aventurine will also send you down a rabbit hole of chance, only not as exhilarating. In today's video, I'm gonna teach you how to build one of the strongest characters in the game. And as a heads up, I do this for most of my videos, but this entire video was recorded on a suboptimal free-to-play setup with a crafted light cone, meaning that the shields and B-roll that you're seeing are of him with a build that you will definitely surpass even if you are a free-to-play player. With all that being said, my name is Braxophone, and let's talk about Aventurine. Aventurine is one of the most flexible characters in all of Honkai Star Rail, which is great for things like reaching the top shelf. Even with a free-to-play setup, his shields are strong enough to save malevolent creep. Unlike our favorite light-haired, blonde ice, tall man, Aventurine can up his shields on the use of his skill or follow-up attack. What does that mean? I'm fairly certain Aventurine would survive the intro blast from Fallout multiple times. His shields are a huge amount of his defense and can actually stack up to be 200% of the current skill strength. So if you have a shield on and you use his skill again, or if you follow-up attack, you can stack it again to a higher max value. What actually makes the shield insane though is that it hits every single teammate, lasts for 3 turns, and because of his talent, it increases the effect resistance of all covered characters, meaning that all of your team can automatically activate Broken Keel and also will probably just never be CC'd ever. This effect res can reach 50% at E0, and Aventurine himself can't be CC'd once every 2 turns, so that's nice. The other part of Submarine's talent allows him to gain stacks towards a follow-up attack. Every time anyone on your team gets attacked with his shield active, Aventurine gains a stack. That also means that if an enemy hits all 4 of your team, he gains 4 stacks. And if Aventurine himself gets hit with a shield up, he actually gets a bonus stack, so you'd gain 5 stacks from the whole team getting attacked instead of 4. Once he has 7 out of 10 possible stacks, he gives enemies a gambling addiction. Now the damage isn't on hyper carry levels or anything, it just does a bit extra and can add up a lot over time. I guess you could call it chip damage. With Aquamarine's traces, he can also add more shields to your whole team after he launches a follow-up attack, and he also can gain stacks whenever your teammates follow-up attack, up to 3 times before his next turn. Another major trace of his gives your team a shield when you enter battle, and his last major trace gives Aventurine crit rate based on his defense. When he has 4,000 defense, he gets 48% crit rate, meaning you should aim to get to around 4,000 defense to max out his damage and shields. I'll go into details on that in the build section though. There are going to be times where you can't actually reach it, and that's going to be fine, but yeah, there's a lot of nuance to it. If you've never been to Vegas, good. Stay the hell out of there, it's a terrible place. Aventurine's ultimate gives you that feeling of winning big, minus the part where you deal a trillion damage. His ultimate gives him a random number 1 to 7 stacks, and also gives enemies a debuff that increases your crit damage dealt to them. It's good for Acheron teams because of the debuff, and it's also just a solid crit buff for your team. Nothing super broken and crazy, but it does help. His technique is also Gamba because it gives you a random defense bonus when you enter combat for 3 turns, which increases the shield size, and this applies to your whole team. Lastly, his talent priority is skill first, then talent, then ultimate, and basic attack if you want to actually level that. Aventurine was made for both players that want to be safe in all content and to be objectified.
Sit on it for a while.
I mean,
when the time is right,
sit on a couple other things.
He's meant to be the DPS preservation character, and honestly, his damage is nothing crazy even with an optimized build. But regardless of his damage, he is easily the best shielder and one of the best at stopping you from losing that Golden Gears run. Because of his flexibility, Listerine can be built in a ton of different ways. You can make him a damage-dealing preservation who makes it rain, or a strong-boned preservation that'll make enemies bust, like in cards, not like the other thing. For relic sets, he can use 4-piece Knight of Purity Palace for big shields, 4-piece Pioneer for damage, or a mix of 2-piece Knight and 2-piece Ash Blazing for a happy medium. There's not really a best set since your light cone and team can drastically affect his value, but I've really enjoyed him on 4-piece Knight just because it makes his shields comfy. But literally nobody is farming that anymore because the new sets kind of put the lightning set into the ground, so for planar sets, I like to use Broken Keel since you get the effect for free with a shield up, but Penacony is also a good option with Dr. Ratio or Imbibitor Lune. And Inert Salsono will let you do a bit more personal damage with his follow-up attacks and his ultimate. On Adventurine's Relics, you'll want to give him a defense or crit damage body, defense or speed boots, imaginary damage or defense sphere, and you'll never guess what the next one is. Basically, you can give Aventurine a DPS setup, but anything is replaceable by defense for shield strength and to try to get 4k defense. Since he gets a ton of crit rate from his traces, you don't have to worry about that stat as much, and you can slap on a crit damage body or a defense one. For boots, I find that going defensive ends up being fine since he can trigger so many follow-up attacks just from enemies hitting his shield in the first place and by him using his ult, so you don't need to worry a ton about him moving quickly. But speed is an option if you do want him to be faster just for the insurance. It's completely up to you if you want him to be a shield bot or a DPS preservation. The fact that he can negate basically all damage in the game at the moment is insane, at least until they make an enemy that can remove your shields, but personally I like to live in blissful ignorance. For reference, here's a comparison of different relic stat setups and their shield strength. And one last thing about his build. If you want to run 3 defense pieces, make sure to drop the crit damage body before you drop the imaginary damage orb most of the time, because it just works out better mathematically. For all of the initial 2.0 story, this guy was incredibly sus. But what else can you expect from someone with Vent in their name? If I had a nickel for every time I saw someone say Aventurine needs his light cone to be good, I'd have 2 nickels, which isn't that many, but it's kind of weird that it's happened twice. Aventurine's light cone is a massive damage increase for him. In fact, it's about 35% better than the free-to-play option, but 35% of 0 is still 0. Okay, his damage isn't 0. In fact, it's actually pretty solid for a sustainer, but there aren't a ton of scenarios for the average player where an E0S1 Aventurine's damage is the difference between clearing MOC or not. At least, not compared to E0S0 Aventurine, when you could invest into another DPS or Harmony character instead of that light cone. For Aventurine specifically, it makes building him incredibly easy and makes his shields a ton stronger. But you can get great shields and decent damage with Moment of Victory, Concert for 2 at S5, and This Is Me even at S1. For free-to-play players, you have Destiny's Threads for Woven 2, which is a pretty solid choice as far as craftables go. There's a ridiculous amount of light cones he can use, with a ton of them being free-to-play friendly, and if you use him as a shield bot only, he's even easier to find light cones for. Here's some charts showing his damage with different light cones and sets. Obviously, a lot of this can change based on your build and content, so just use it as a general guideline, and not the end-all be-all. If there's one thing I've learned about this guy, it's that you can always bet on Aventurine. Being as he is a shielder that works basically in any team in the entire game, with the exception of maybe Jingliu and Blade depending on the content, he is an astoundingly good unit in most scenarios. This means that he can basically fit into any team and provide insane value. I've covered this in another video, but compared to Locha, who heals just like an ass ton of damage, Aventurine has the advantage of giving you effective HP or extra HP on top of the HP that you already have, meaning that compared to healers, he ends up being a more universal use case. Now, that's not to say that there's not going to be enemies in the future that completely obliterate shield by just removing it with an ability or something, but as of right now, Aventurine is one of the best sustainers in the entire game. So let me go over what he kind of works with. This is just one example team where he can work just fine, and I wanted to use it a team that wasn't reliant on follow-up attacks to show you guys how flexible he could actually be. Danheng and Imbibitor Lune got a massive buff from Sparkle's existence, and you can play Danheng with Tingyun and Sparkle to get a ton of damage. Aventurine is just in there to sustain, and the value that Aventurine brings here is mostly just gonna be that, and a little bit of extra damage, but he's not getting buffed by either of your harmonies. Now, one thing that I don't see a lot of people talking about is that Aventurine actually wants to be in the 2nd or 3rd slot in your teams. The reason is because Aventurine's shields are so strong that odds are they're not going to end up doing actual damage to your team, and if they do, it's not going to be a ton. By putting Aventurine in your 2nd or 3rd slot, you're basically ensuring that on hits that hit 3 of your teammates, the one in the middle, the one on the left, and the right, all 3 of those characters are going to get energy. There's an argument to be made about putting your preservation on the far left or far right to mitigate damage whenever you take cleaves, but in this case, because you don't have to worry about damage being taken in the first place because Aventurine's shields are so strong, it's best to put him in slot 2 or 3, so that way he can help battery Tingyun and Danheng whenever he takes personal damage. Sparkle doesn't have to worry about that because her rotation is really solid without any extra help, but for these two, for Tingyun and Danheng, they can actually use it. And that's a theme you'll see throughout the rest of these teams. The next team I want to showcase is an Acheron, Pela, Gwynaifen team. Now this is Acheron double Nihility. I honestly think that we are still waiting on a better Nihility to pair up with Acheron than Gwynaifen. Sorry, Gwynaifen, you're amazing and you're so goddamn cute, but like you just are not on par with her. It's not close. Aventurine, with or without his light cone, can apply a debuff to enemies with his crit damage buff from his ultimate. But one valuable thing that you can do with Aventurine here is you can use Trend of the Universal Market, because it also has a chance to apply debuff to enemies whenever you get attacked, which will help get Acheron more stacks more quickly. So if you don't have a signature light cone and you want to help battery Acheron faster, give him Trend of the Universal Market and just build him with defense, in my opinion. He's one of the best pairings with Acheron because though Gallagher can apply a debuff, and I personally really like playing Gallagher, Aventurine just stops you from taking damage ever. It's amazing. And his number one synergy or best team synergy is going to be with Dr. Ratio, Topaz, and Ruan Mei. And as you'll notice with both of these teams, he's still in the second slot because you want to actually be able to battery Gwynaifen and Pela. You want to be able to battery Dr. Ratio and Topaz and Numby. You don't have to worry about Acheron here, so that's why she's off to the side. And Ruan Mei has a really solid rotation that doesn't really change, and she gets ult up fairly consistent. So the reason this team is so insanely good is because Aventurine gets extra stacks towards his shield or towards his follow-up attack that provides shield technically based off of other teammates' follow-up attacks. Between Dr. Ratio and Topaz and Numby, it helps him get his follow-up attack off a lot more frequently, and it makes it so that he doesn't have to spend as many skill points. Now, the thing is, with Dr. Ratio, Topaz, and Ruan Mei, Topaz and Ruan Mei don't actually have to use a lot of SP, so you can still spam shield with him, but it also opens up the field to you using skill on Topaz as opposed to basic attack. It's not a massive damage jump, but it is noticeable, and because you're gonna have so much SP, it doesn't really matter. Ruan Mei is going to buff Dr. Ratio and Topaz, and this has already been a really solid synergy, but Aventurine, since he does damage, he also benefits from Ruan Mei as well. And this team overall is one of the most consistent teams for Aventurine, and honestly one of the comfiest. I really love this team. And the last one I kind of wanted to showcase was a dot team with Kafka and Gwynaifen. Now, usually with Kafka, people are used to playing like 2 dots or a dot in Ruan Mei, and that's kind of what this is. As you may have noticed, Ruan Mei is off to the side. It's because if you cleave Aventurine, you want Kafka and Gwynaifen to get the energy. Ruan Mei has a really consistent rotation, so you don't have to worry about that. I use Gwynaifen here just because she's amazing. Look at her. I love her so much. You can really use any other dot character right here, except Sampo, because that's cringe. I hate that guy. You can play Sampo if you want. I don't really care. But the reason this is valuable is just because Aventurine is going to stop anyone from taking. I mean, are you picking up on a theme here? Ruan Mei also buffs Aventurine, so all 3 characters are getting a damage increase here. And for Aventurine, it's gonna be pretty significant because Ruan Mei is so dang strong. And this team overall is pretty good. I think technically speaking, Ho-Ho is a little bit better. But again, if you're playing Aventurine, you don't have to worry about death under any circumstances. And Kafka can proc a follow-up attack, which does help Aventurine get more of his follow-up attacks off. Overall, he's literally one of the most flexible characters in the entire game. If you don't have Fushuan, he can fit into most teams that Fushuan can't, except for Mono Quantum, because he's not Quantum. And between the two of these characters, honestly, I'm probably just gonna make a whole video on this so you guys can know. I really like Aventurine in most teams that I've played him in, and these two ultimately have different use cases. Now, I know we got a lot of simps in the chat, in the YouTube comment. I know you guys like him. I know you guys think he's on. But before you swipe, let's go over his Eidolons. Most of the 5-star sustainers and supports have crazy blanket buff Eidolons, and this guy is no exception. Trampoline has some great general support Eidolons. For example, his E1 gives crit damage to teammates with a shield up, and makes it so that Aventurine's ult gives everyone shield whenever he uses it. Pretty solid overall. His E2, Bounded Rationality, reduces enemy resistances whenever he basic attacks them, which for preservation is a pretty insane Eidolon to have, but it is only single target, and it is only going to be about 12% red shred. Either way, pretty solid. His E3, Girth maxing, increases his ultimate and basic attack level. E4 gives him a defense increase after triggering his follow-up, and also increases his hits on follow-up from 7 to 10, which is decent damage overall. E5 is a skill and talent level up, and E6 what in the Mr. Beast? E6 increases Aventurine's damage dealt based on how many shielded allies you have. With E6, his damage potential gets close to what you could see on a hyper carry character. All it takes is the low price of half a month's rent in Los Angeles, or like 3 months rent anywhere else, and he'd be doing insane damage for a preservation character. So for those of you who are down horrendous for Mr. Clean, enjoy breaking the game in some strange ways. For the average player and even for low spenders, I don't super recommend going for Eidolons or his light cone. But if you want to invest in an Aventurine, his E1 is gonna increase your team's damage without needing to be in a specific scenario, and it also just makes his shields more consistent. Maybe it'll save you SP every now and then. His shields are already crazy though, and that means that the ultimate shields are not even super necessary. With that said, the more invested your characters are, the less valuable his E1 is. Also, if you're playing him in an Acheron team, that debuff that he can give with his light cone is insanely helpful and can be more worth it than Eidolons. It's also a team damage increase due to the vulnerability, so it's kind of up to how your account looks. For example, high investment accounts with good crit ratios may benefit more from him having a signature light cone. But keep in mind that his light cone is not as universal as some other characters' light cones, just because only himself and March 7th can actually activate it. This is a character that you only go for more than E0 S0 on him if you really like him. And between light cones and Eidolons, you can't go wrong either way if you were already planning on spending. Anyways, I don't really know if that was super helpful, and if you can't decide, then I just wouldn't get either. Later gamers, don't commit tax fraud.